This is a paper co-authored with Herbert Kitschelt from Duke University. I'm Dan Kselman from IE Business School in Madrid. And we're going to be studying the organizational foundations of clientelistic strategies. So this is part of a more general project that Herbert and I have been working on for about 3 or 4 years now. That project at some basic level is studying the different forms of accountability and linkage that political parties and candidates can tie and develop to voters. And the 2 forms of democratic accountability or linkage that we're particularly interested are programmatic linkage. What we mean here is that, sort of in some basic framework, politicians go out and promise policy packages to voters. Voters choose politicians based on the idea that one of those policy packages is more proximate to their ideal point. And if political parties or candidates once in office don't adhere to their policy promises, voters will sort of remove them from office. So the idea of accountability and linkage in programmatic systems is developed through policy promises and policy-based voting. Clientelism, on the other hand, instead of voting being grounded in voters evaluating policy packages using sort of a proximity logic, voters are evaluating here material gains. They're evaluating parties based on which party they believe will be most effective and most generous in providing them anything from chickens to civil service jobs. And that's a very different form of tying oneself to the electorate, but a form of accountability in our mind nonetheless. And our central question in all of this research, the first paper that we published using some new data that I'll present in a second was just sort of more or less descriptive paper documenting the kind of cross-national variation that exists in these 2 types of accountability strategies. But the question now, more sort of in some sense enticing and interesting that we're asking in a new series of papers, this included, is what types of organizational forms facilitate one or the other linkage strategies. And in particular, if you think about the new economics of organization from Coase to Williamson, etc., what they argue is that certain types of firms, and in particular certain types of firm structures, centralized firms, firms that organize corporate governance in a particular way, etc., are particularly good at effectuating certain types of economic contracts. We're thinking of political parties in very much the same way. These linkage strategies or accountability mechanisms we think of as contracting mechanisms between voters and elected officials. And political parties, like firms, depending on their organizational structure, how centralized they are, how extensive they are, as we'll see in a second, might be particularly good at one or the other form of contracting with voters. So anyways, we have a separate paper which we've been banging around for about 4 years now, which we finally have in shape to submit for rejection, or I hope not actually submit for publication very soon, arguing that there are certain organizational forms which are particularly good, which are particularly facilitating when it comes to political parties making cohesive and campaign promises which don't exhibit a lot of standard deviations. And that paper we'll discuss very quickly here. And in that paper, what we argue is that their organizations, political party organizations, have to sort of solve 2 important problems when making cohesive organizational promises. First of all, they have to have a social choice problem. You have a political party organization which has many, many diverse actors. You have activists and MPs and funders, etc. And these actors oftentimes have very different ideological or policy preferences, and political parties have to co-design kind of cohesive platforms for voters which deal with this heterogeneity. And these platforms not only need to be sort of clear and homogeneous, but they need to be credible intertemporally, so that once you promise a clear and sort of uncohesive platform to voters, not only do the voters know what you're promising, because it's clear and cohesive, they also believe that you're actually going to implement it when office, and we argue that there are certain organizational forms that are really good at making both clear and intertemporally credible promises to voters. And in particular, we argue that organizational centralization is a very good mechanism for generating clear platforms when faced with heterogeneous internal actors, but is not a very good mechanism for generating intertemporally credible platforms because short-term oriented political leaders, party leaders often will defect if they see short-term gains involved. So centralization has kind of competing effects, and in this paper we use various interactive methodologies to tease out those competing effects. on the ability of parties to make clear, credible, programmatic choices. On the other hand, in clientelist organizations, we're going to see in just a second, we're going to argue that centralization does not have these competing effects. That centralization is just basically unambiguously good for developing sound and effective clientelistic linkages to voters. In particular, we're going to argue that clientelism, for a variety of reasons, requires what Duverger and Yanda called geographic extensiveness. Not surprisingly, if you want to sort of target voters with anything from chickens to civil service jobs, there's all kinds of reasons that you need to be able to monitor that targeting process. You need to be able to identify which voters are going to give you multiplier effects. For example, sometimes targeting a chicken to the head of a family will give you 12 votes, whereas targeting a chicken to a different head of a family will only give you 6 votes. So you really need to have pretty extensive on-the-ground knowledge to both develop, effectively consummate, and then eventually monitor and enforce these clientelistic linkages. Not a surprising fact there. A little bit more surprising is going to be our argument about what kind of extensiveness, what kind of geographic extensiveness is most effective for generating these types of effective clientelistic exchanges. And we distinguish between formal geographic extensiveness. This is, parties having branches on the ground full of sort of, oftentimes full-time and even potentially paid staff, having ancillary organizations, for example, like party soccer clubs and party dinners, etc. Sort of formal local organization that is explicitly tied to the organization and its symbology and its name, etc. And then informal organization, what we call nonpartisan nobles or brokers. I actually was discussing to our chair of a panel yesterday in which a really interesting paper was presented on chiefs as brokers, chiefs who have no explicit tie to chiefs in sub-Saharan Africa, to political party organizations, but who do an excellent job sort of organizing clientelistic linkages. Here we're talking about non-affiliated local notables who organize and do all of this monitoring and identifying and enforcement, etc. for voters, but do it without the benefit of a local branch or a local soccer club, etc. And what we're going to argue is that what you really need, so I'm getting at this slide a little bit ahead of myself, that what we argue in the paper in a very preliminary way, all of this is very preliminary, we have to revise this paper in a variety of ways that we'll see in the conclusions, but we're going to argue basically that for a variety of reasons, and this sort of goes counter to much of the thinking about clientelist linkage, if you read Stokes 2005 and others, that you don't really, there's a lot of emphasis on kind of machines, party machines and local, formal kind of party machines as being the mechanisms which are going to allow political parties and candidates to do this local level kind of soaking and poking necessary to effectuate good clientelistic linkages. We're going to argue actually that party machines, for a variety of reasons, formalized geographic extensiveness is actually not necessarily good for clientelism. In the paper, we argue it's not necessarily bad for clientelism, but for a whole variety of reasons, formal party organization at the local level might not really be that good for clientelism. That formal party activists often are sort of ideologues who don't look upon clientelism as a nice mechanism. Oftentimes, formal branches are not actually populated by locals. They're populated by implants from national organizations. Mariella Schwarzberg has really interesting papers on activists in formal branches that try to undermine clientelistic linkages in Argentina for a variety of reasons. So for a variety of reasons, we're going to argue that it's really not formal, but informal organization that you need to develop sound clientelistic linkages. What you really need is these local brokers who are not explicitly tied to parties, which for a variety of reasons, those explicit ties might undermine clientelism, but which are sort of explicitly tied to local neighborhoods, to local networks, and who can really, in a way that formal branch activists can't, effectuate these really sound clientelistic linkages. Now, on the other hand, having all of these informal kind of notables or agents, you might call them, on the ground for political parties, and continually looking around to see if that 5 is up there. Is that okay? Looks like I'm doing okay.
You're just about at 5.
Okay, good. So, presents certain challenges, and in particular what we're going to argue, and I'm in the process of formalizing this in a very simple kind of toy setup, but a useful setup, is that having all these local agents on the ground presents a collective action problem, in that what these local agents really want to do is they want to maximize their local standing among among their networks, among their neighborhoods, among their religious associations, etc. And they also want to put some money in their pocket, obviously, we don't deny that. And these sort of localized and individualized incentives oftentimes will lead them to over-allocate money to, for example, core constituents whose vote is sort of already solidified for the party, but who they are continuing to try to sort of maintain as part of their core network. And we'll under-allocate money, for example, to swing voters, we'll under-allocate money in general to voters, we'll put too much in their pockets, etc., etc. And although all of these local notables have every interest in the party that they're sort of serving as agents for winning the election, there's a kind of free-riding problem where each of these individual local notables wants to defect and put as much money into their pockets and devote as much money to core constituencies as possible, and eventually you might lose the election. So it's a typical kind of problem of collective action. And organizational centralization, we argue for a variety of reasons, is potentially an effective solution to this collective action problem at the local level. All of that is informal in the paper as it stands, but not terribly difficult to formalize. And I'll talk about some interesting subsidiary results that are starting to emerge from that formalization. Two basic hypotheses. Clientelism should impel parties to extensiveness. So clientelistic parties should be certainly much more geographically extensive than non-clientelistic parties, and especially extensiveness of the informal and not the formal variety. And second of all, clientelism should be heavily grounded. Clientelistic parties should be centralized, because you have to solve these kind of collective action problems whereby individual notables have every incentive to defect, but if they do so, the party loses. So here I'll go very quickly through the data that we're using to measure this. It comes from the Duke University Democratic Accountability and Linkages Project. How do we measure? This is an expert survey, so I know right there I've lost 50% of you when you say the word expert survey, but you have to do something. And so we tried to measure clientelism. We got a pretty decent-sized grant from the World Bank to do this. We're working with Phil Kiefer. And so how do we measure clientelism? Well, we sent this survey to 88 countries, thousands of experts all over the world, and we asked them to score parties' clientelistic efforts. And apologies, this is the Turkish survey. I don't know why it's Turkish and not English, but I'll tell you what that Turkish means. For example, consider whether candidates and parties give a promise to give citizens consumer goods, food, liquor, clothes, footwear, etc., as inducement to obtain their votes. How much effort do they expend? We had a bunch. We're very careful in the survey, as close as we can to being a viable instrument in the expert survey level. And so here we have I don't know. There's no pointer, so I don't know is on the far right. None, some, moderate, and a lot, etc., etc. Just, I mean, it's not perfect, it's noisy, but we're trying to get a sense, and we give them very clear repairs at the beginning of this section saying, just because a party only does 10% of its vote seeking via clientelism, that's a lot in certain context. We're very careful, but that's not going to convince many people. Measuring extensiveness. Here we have, again, the same survey has a battery of questions on party organization. For example, how do we measure extensiveness? Political parties differ greatly, yada, yada, yada. Do the following parties or their individual candidates maintain offices and paid staff at the local and municipal level? If yes, are these offices and paid staff permanent or only during national elections? And here again, we have a simple, I don't know on the far right. No, parties do not maintain formal branches. Yes, parties maintain formal branches, but only during elections. Yes, parties maintain branches in some districts. And yes, parties maintain branches in almost all districts. Again, a noisy measure, but we wanted to get a sense. We wanted to force experts to give us a basic judgment on how extensive these parties are. And we have an identical question relating to informal extensiveness. So this is the sort of formal local branches, local soccer associations, etc. We have the same question for informal branches. And finally, how do we measure centralization? Again, same expert survey instrument. More generally, the power to select candidates, we're using candidate selection for a variety of reasons we suggest in the paper. The best way to measure how centralized a political party organization is to ask who controls its selection of legislative candidates. And we ask them, are these controlled by national officers? Are these controlled by regional officers? Are these controlled by local level actors, or some bargaining between the two? We experiment with a variety of rescaling. That's our centralization measure. Here's national, I don't know, again, always on the far right. And then local, regional, national bargaining, etc. So we use that as a measure of centralization. Some quick descriptive statistics. So this is 88 countries, 506 political parties. So the data set we're going to use here is N506, a simple cross-section from 2007-2008. And the clientelism variable varies from 1 to 4 with a mean of 2.5 roughly, and a standard deviation of about 3/4. And then these various descriptives, I'm not obviously going to report any of the regression results. The dependent variable in all of these regressions is organizational. So in this regression, the dependent variable is the extent of informal organization a party exhibits, and in this regression, the dependent variable is the extent of centralization a party exhibits. We use a variety. We use, so for example, the Huber-White standard error correction, et cetera, These are purely correlational because we obviously have endogeneity here, and one of the absolute next steps is coming up with kind of a two-stage or sort of identification strategy for these results. So nothing causal here at all. But in a correlational sense, we see that it's very clear that the more clientelism a party uses, the more centralized they are, and the effect is substantively significant. Moving from one standard deviation below to one above the clientelism variable increases the centralization measure by about a standard deviation, increases the notable measure by also about a standard deviation. Coincidentally, this substantive effect is identical in the two, and doesn't have any increase on this kind of machine politics, this formal organization variable, all consistent with hypotheses, all purely correlational, and we obviously need an identification strategy. So, quick conclusion, we obviously need some more sophisticated strategy for causal identification. These are purely correlational and very preliminary results, but at least at a purely correlational level, we seem to have what we're interested in. I'm working on a formalization of the theory. Nothing fancy here. I mean, it's a collective action problem that centralization might solve, but some subsidiary results that are very interesting, including that centralization might be particularly effective when you have certain ideological profiles, etc. And you know what? We're just going to call it an end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.